Welcome to Musical Creatures, How Vertebrate Locomotion Shapes Human Music. I'm Francis Levy. Ed Brissesi and I are co-directors of the Vertebrate Center. Now, the walls are bare today. Usually we have an exhibit up. We just had an exhibit called The Body as Image, which accompanied our 6 roundtables on sexuality that particular show was curated by Hallie Cohen and Adam, with the help of Adam Ludwig. And we will be having another show coming up in this space on the Phillipson Bible, right? That's the Phillipson Bible and Freud's visual imagination. Is that the working title? So that will be, and when will that show, Hallie, be?
October 31st.
October 31st. On Saturday, November 22nd, we have a very interesting event coming on. It's called I'll Go On, an afternoon with Samuel Beckett, and we're showing some rarely shown films of Beckett's. It will be an hour and a half of films, one of which was directed by Edward Albee, and Edward Albee is going to be there. John Turturro is going to be there. Tom Bishop from NYU, Alvin Epstein, the actor, and our own Lois Oppenheim. Now, Nicholson Baker, Judith Thurman, Simon Winchester, among the other distinguished panelists who will be appearing at Philoctetes this coming fall and into the winter. So go to philoctetes.org to consult our calendar. All Philoctetes events are recorded, as you can see, on this 3-camera setup. And you can go to past programming to see any event you miss. And they're all also simulcast. So on a night like tonight, we first of all thank you for coming. And for those of you who couldn't make it, you can see it at home. I'm now pleased to present Stephanie Chase. Stephanie Chase is a violinist who has performed as soloist with many of the world's leading orchestras, including the New York Philharmonic, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, London Symphony Orchestra, and Hong Kong Philharmonic. She is also artistic director and co-founder of the Music of the Sphere Society, which is dedicated to exploring the links between music, philosophy, and the sciences. She teaches violin at New York University's Steinhardt School. In her spare time, she writes music arrangements and studies Stradivari violins. In late May 2008, she will perform one of her signature works, Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto, in Stern Auditorium at Carnegie Hall. Stephanie will host this evening's discussion and introduce our distinguished guest.
Thank you so much, Francis. I have to back up. I think the biography should have had one little phrase excised or something put in the past tense, which is that I played at Carnegie Hall recently. But thanks for bringing it up again. I appreciate that. It was fun. I hope to go back soon.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's my fault. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. The weather is terrible, but those who are watching on the webcast, thank you also for coming for what promises to be a very, very interesting event. I was introduced to your work, I believe, through Hallie Cohen a couple of years ago, and you, in fact, made a presentation. This is Andrew Warshaw, everybody. Made a presentation for us at the Music of the Sphere Society, which was fascinating. And I'm so glad you could join us tonight. And you have brought a couple of musicians along with you to help illustrate these ideas. Briefly, because we have a lot of material to cover, I think. I just wanted to say that in thinking about your topic here and these ideas that you're presenting to us, which are really wonderfully rare, and I know that this is also a work in progress,
Very
but
much so. Yeah.
It's fascinating. But it reminds me of correlations between music and nature. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to say a couple of brief words, and again, to remind everybody that I'm just a violinist. I speak from a violinist perspective for almost everything, and I'm not a scientist or anything. But I just would like to say that music is composed or organized sound, and very often composers and others have been inspired by nature. Some obvious choices of compositions to think about that were inspired by nature are Beethoven's, I believe it's the 6th Symphony, the Pastoral Symphony, with the scene by the brook and the chirping of the birds in the tree. And another very obvious example is music by Vivaldi, for instance, from the Four Seasons, which is quite programmatic. And in fact, the Summer Concerto features a very vivid thunderstorm. It's a lot of fun to hear, and it's even more fun to play. Another example of somebody who's inspired by nature is Olivier Messiaen with his bird songs. Was inspired very much for a lot of his music by nature. And this extends to the interpretation of music, and I mean as from a performance aspect, to make it sound natural, because I think when we interpret music, we're trying to find the natural in music, which is a subject of discussion between Leopold Mozart and his son Wolfgang already in the 1770s regarding vibrato and its use to create emotion and interpretation, emotion in the sound, which should relate to the sound of the human voice when it is filled with emotion. And then another aspect to think about, relating nature with music, are the instruments themselves. Stradivarius made his instruments based on the braccio, or the brazzo, which is the Cremonese word for braccio, which is an arm length. And so my violin comes from another maker who left Cremona but went to Venice, Peter Guarneri of Venice. And it was interesting to me the day I realized that this is the arm length in the violin. And that braccio in Cremona, in fact, dates back to at least, I think, the 13th century because it was inscribed in a wall that dates from that time. So it's a very ancient idea. And then keyboard instruments also, they have to relate to key spans, widths, hand widths. And then finally, we have the rhythms and the pacing of music, which has to do with, often with dance forms, which arise out of movement. And so obvious examples of this are minuets and jigs, for instance. But we also are playing the andante tempo, which is a walking tempo. In any case, that's enough for me on that. I would like to read a little bit about Andrew Warshaw, who is an associate professor of music and dance at Marymount Manhattan College. He is a composer, writer, and former dancer whose music theater works, film, and dance scores have been presented at venues throughout New York City and the U.S., including premieres at the Zellerbach Theater, Lincoln Center, and Dance Theater Workshop. His collaborators have ranged from writers George C. Wolfe and David Lindsay Aber to choreographers and dancers as diverse as site-specific conceptualist Stephen Koplowitz, improviser extraordinaire Nancy Stark-Smith, ballet maker Katie Langen, and the unclassifiable, Sarah Shelton Mann and her company Contraband. Warshaw is currently writing the libretto and music for The Sparks, The Ringing, a 2-evening-long opera about an African-American musicologist with a 9-year-old Hasidic son. The Sparks, The Ringing, has been given support by numerous foundations and granting organizations, with major sections performed at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. Warshaw's recent work on locomotion encoded musical patterns, tonight's subject, has been published in the Journal of Music and Dance and presented at conferences sponsored by Cambridge University Center for Music and Science and l'Observatoire International de la Création Musicale, thank you. OICM at the Université de Montréal.
She got it all.
Ça va. Thank you. I practiced, actually. Several of his papers on the topic are available at his faculty page at Marymount Manhattan College or on the website of the OICM. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Warshaw.
Well, thank you for coming on a rainy night, and thank you for that introduction. It's always nice to be introduced in a way that you know nothing about, because the images are interesting. No, I had no idea what she was going to say, and I like the setup, because the notion that music has to do with nature, I noticed you gave examples that were imitative, the Beethoven and the Vivaldi as well. Mm-hmm. Where the composers are imitating nature, and then you move to something kind of fitted, the body fitted to music, and then the last things you talked about were the sense of pulse, the internalization of the experience of time. And my work in this area is very much on the latter end of those examples. This is really work that has to do with inherent connections between nature and the natural world and music. So much so that there's no piece of music that doesn't reflect nature in the way that I'm looking at it. I want to talk a little bit about how I found my way to this, but I'd like to introduce my colleagues before I do that. These two gentlemen, these two incredible musicians, have actually been exploring this with me, not from the beginning. I wrote a lot before I started talking with them, but they were kind enough to read my early writings and kind of crawl inside the system of it. And I'm very much in their debt in the development of it. Let me read you their bios just so we know who we're with tonight. Drummer and percussionist is Damian Bassman. He's written and performed the drum and percussion books for many Broadway and off-Broadway shows, including The Color Purple and Next to Normal. And he regularly travels to Europe, where he's a guest soloist with several European orchestras, Berlin Philharmonic, players as one. Damien's cross-genre playing has allowed him to collaborate with a variety of artists, including Joe Zawinul, Paquito de Rivera, Marcel Khalif, Green Day, Goran Bregovic, Barry Manilow, and Elton John last week, right? Elton John last week. Bill Moulton is an associate arts professor at New York University Tisch School of the Arts in the dance department. He's the music director in the dance department there. I'm the music director in the dance department at Marymount. Bill is the founder and the first president, right, of the International Guild of Musicians in Dance, and has really been a pioneer in developing that field and that profession. Bill is also a professional tennis teacher. Which is no accident that he would be looking at this. Okay, I'd like to speak a little bit about how I got to the musical examples that you'll hear in about 10 minutes. I think it'll take me that long to work my way there. When I was a dancer in college, and I did something in a performance challenging physical laws, and it didn't work out well for me, and I injured my knee. And my brother was dancing at Hampshire College in Amherst, Northampton, Massachusetts. And he said, you know, there's a woman here that a lot of dancers in New York see, and I think you should come up here and let her tell you whether to get a knee operation or not. So I went and met Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen. And Bonnie looked at my knee, taught me a lot about the anatomy, advised me against an operation. It was a revelation to be led inside the anatomy in the way that she does that. And I actually stayed in town for a year and studied with her and other people. And Bonnie Cohen's work is certainly fundamental to whatever I'm going to show you here. And I want to talk a little bit about the relationship. She teaches anatomy. She has a school for body-mind centering up there and has probably trained hundreds, if not thousands, of practitioners of one sort or another over the years worldwide. And at the center of her work is always, I think, the study of something called basic neurological patterns. I think that's her term, the basic neurological patterns. I'm going to lay them out for you. I'm going to show you the neurological patterns according to Bonnie. But these patterns are representative of thought that's developed in a lot of different areas. Embodied cognition theorists, embodied cognition philosophers, as well as dancers, all have written and theorized about movement that is hardwired in us, that is our legacy as human beings, and that is evidence of the fact that the development of our intelligence, even our ability to operate cognitively, our ability to think abstractly, is actually built on the platform of our movement experience. Bonnie's patterns are a physical illustration of it, but there's a lot of writing on it. That the movement capabilities that we've inherited over the millennia are really the basic building blocks of our thinking in many respects. So I think I should. Let me say one more thing before I actually show you the patterns. I should say something just to get the debts clear here. Bonnie didn't invent this work. Bonnie Cohen didn't. It came actually from the work of a neuroscientist in the 1940s, a man named Temple Fay. He was a teacher at Temple University, and he initiated this investigation when he was working with children with cerebral palsy. And he was paying attention to their movement deficits and noticing that they have high brain lesions. What he theorizes is that their problems with movement are due to problems with high brain lesions. He speculated if I could find movement that was intimately connected to lower brain centers, that might be movement that would be accessible by these children. And so in order to develop movement that was connected, activated by low brain centers, controlled by low brain centers, he reasoned that the higher brain is a newer part of the brain, lower brain is the older part of the brain, and he needed to look at, in effect, older movement, the movement that had been with us longer, in order to find promising movement for these children. And so he made an examination of vertebrates and movement in vertebrates. And he ended up codifying a series of locomotion patterns that were roughly correlated with the stages of vertebrate evolution. patterns that were more snake-like, more lizard-like, more mammal-like, so on, in a progression that I'll show you. He went on to use this material with cerebral palsy patients. It was in vogue for a long time. It's been developed by practitioners, by other organizations. It's got a record of therapeutic use over the last 50, 60 years. It's actually a complex record and a contested record. The thing that's unique about Bonnie Cohen's recontextualization of this work is she's taken the patterns. She does have theoretical application of them, but she has applied them to work with all populations of people, with performers who simply want to move more effectively, precisely, and with more feeling, performers with execution problems, with limitations in their bodies. She might also use them with people with brain injuries, but she's got a much wider range of references for these patterns. And in fact, her work has been very widely acknowledged. The National Dance Education Organization includes her categories, her work, in their recommendations of how children should be taught dance now, 5th through 12th grade and in college. So this work is very influential. I studied with her, and let's look at the patterns. I think I may take my mic off and show you some of them in movement, but I certainly want to show you some of them in pictures. All right, the oldest patterns are spinal patterns. Oldest, I really shouldn't even be saying oldest, because in some senses I'm not qualified to speak about the evolutionary history. I know what the categories are. Spinal patterning is movement that is initiated usually at the mouth, but moves through the head, through the neck, down and out the tail. My tail has fallen off, but we've got a remnant of it. And you can see this diver moving through that progression, and that sequence of movements is what's supporting her. You see spinal movement, of course, in snakes, in fish, and you see it in infants as they figure out how to get their head up off the ground. It's all initiated by the head, but it's carried out through the spine. And you see at the end, the infant's arms are starting to come into play. You can see the infant isn't really pushing through the arms yet. Let's look at the next slide and try and catch hold of these names, because I'm going to use them often. This next one is homologous. So from the spinal to the homologous. And the homologous patterns, you see the uppers are pushing or reaching. The frog's legs are pushing off, but his neck is actually, it looks like his head is reaching into space. But the infant's reaching with the uppers down here. And the reaching happens, or the pushing happens, in a way that both limbs are used in concert with each other. That's the second category. The third category are homolateral patterns. Now, with homolateral patterning, you'll find a lot of animals who actually move homolaterally. Humans do not pass through a homolateral stage as discreetly as some of the other stages. But the homolateral patterns are in our repertoire, and they're very important. We use them to prepare for other movements. With the homolateral patterns, you've got the same side limbs operating together. I'm going to take this off, because I just want to show one. I find it amusing that we make fun of homolateral patterning now. And, humans don't, I'm not going to be able to crawl homolaterally, because we don't. But, movement that happens like this is Frankensteinian for us. And we recognize it as not quite fully in the human situation. Here's the next slide. Something we do. All right, the final stage is contralateral patterning. And with contralateral, you have an opposition between the lower limb and the opposite limb. The things that are significant about the contralateral pattern, for the way I've used it, is certainly the opposition, but it's the fact that the opposition crosses the body, that spiralic movement is supported particularly well by this diagonal across the body. The pictures really do speak very elegantly. I think these are intelligible, so we'll move on from there. So I learned, I studied these patterns with Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen. And sometime either shortly after or while I was studying them, I don't really remember what it was. It must have been afterwards. Because I moved to San Francisco and I bought an African xylophone. And one day I was playing it and I noticed, oh my goodness, yes, that's homologous. And this is homolateral. And this must be contralateral. And I thought, what a wonderful correspondence. So it delighted me, but I really didn't know what to do with it. I felt strongly that this vocabulary did have the potential to illuminate something about musical structures. But my first observations about it were very simple and linear. I couldn't go much beyond that. I felt so strongly that there must be something because of one other thing I want to mention about the patterns. One of the things that Bonnie Cohen has added to tempo phase ideas is that the patterns are not just movements. They seem to be, and I'd love it if I could push the chairs back and have you all do the patterns with me, because that would be most convincing, and everyone at home as well. If you do the patterns, you realize that each one has a discrete experience of being done. It's as though they part of their definition is the affective dimension of their execution. And when you feel the patterns, when you experience them, you get a very different picture of what they are than just witnessing them or thinking of them abstractly. And because of this, I was able to think of the patterns always as expressive elements. They weren't just mechanical things that you do because you're born with them. They're a certain kind of living. They're a certain way of being. And I thought, okay, if ways of being are intertwined in movement life, wouldn't it be lovely to be able to show that ways of being are intertwined in musical life? And that's really what I was going for. That's what I wanted to show, that the patterns would say something about, what musical structures were, what they were made of, and also something about how they would come into being from our humanness and from the different ways we can be people. So it was an ambitious thought. It took me 25 years to do anything about it. I would try and think about it now and again, but I couldn't make it go anywhere. And then a couple of years ago, I took another hard look at it, and I had a breakthrough. And this is a breakthrough. I looked at the experience of doing the patterns, and I acknowledged that they take place in space. They take place in three-dimensional space. So as here's the ground right here, and I'm galloping along the ground. I'm moving forward, I'm moving down, and also I may turn. I may move to this side as an animal or to that side. So I tried to start making correspondences of that fact. And the first thing that struck me was that the motion that an animal makes in the vertical plane, whereby the animal hits the ground, is exactly analogous to what percussionists do when they hit their instruments. It was a simple thought, but it really let me right away describe how the patterns came to life on different instruments just in this one dimension, just in the dimension of being struck. So I ended up naming, really defining the way that these patterns were reliably expressed in music making. And that's the first thing we're going to show. There are three terms, and I'm sorry I don't have slides for the terms, but I'm going to tell them to you. The first terms that I invented for this thing I was looking for were homologous strike patterns. So these are patterns in which the player strikes the instrument as an animal with both hands simultaneously. No separation. Homolateral strikes. And the essential idea in homolateral strike is that there's differentiation between the two sides of the body. Because that's the essential event in this. The upper and lower are still coupled, but the body is divided across the midline. So that created a set of rules for homolateral strike playing with the musicians. And I'll maybe explain each one before we do it. And then contralateral playing. With contralateral playing, well, I won't do the rules. We'll do them one at a time. I am so pleased that Stephanie called me and said, could I play some examples too? So we're going to hear them on percussion, and we're going to hear them then on the violin. To reckon the patterns on violin it's not that I hadn't thought about it before. I had actually worked with a cellist. To work with someone of Stephanie's virtuosity and command of repertoire really let us go a few stages more the other day. We only met once, and so she's only had the slightest chance to get her head on these. But she's going to play some examples of the patterns as well. First, we're going to do homologous strike patterns. And do we need to say anything more? No, I don't think we do. We've worked this out. We've kind of worked this out.
You want us both to play this one?
Who starts?
Okay.
Deserve the clapping. Now, there are a few things that I want to, before we turn to Stephanie, there are a few points I want to make. The way I'm listening to them is, what are they playing? How does it sound? Same as you are. I'm also ever appreciative of the fact that when they're restricted to homologous playing, there's a lot of music there. And I don't know whether you saw Damien's feet, but he's using both of his feet at the same time, the same as the uppers. The music, we could play 4 or 5 examples, and there seems to always be, to my ear at least, a reliable quality to the playing that no matter what notes they pick, no matter what rhythmic patterns, it still has a homologous nature. Something that's clear, direct, focused. Let's hear Stephanie do a few examples of homologous playing on the violin. So the rules are the same. Both her arms have to strike at the same time. This is a strike, and also a change of a pitch or an impulse through her fingers. These are also strikes.
Introduction to Arpeggioso?
And it's what's fascinating to me always is it's very restricted. That's all she can do. And almost the force of the music almost comes from its restriction. Staying with that, pattern.
It lets go immediately after that.
Right. Well, it has to.
Yeah, it has to do something.
It has to. Yeah.
And this was another example that we came up with.
It's in miniature. Each movement of the finger has a strike of the right hand. And Bill can actually do the same thing. If Bill plays homologously, do you have anything that you just knock something out of it? Yeah. If he just strikes homologously through the fingers, the same state happens.
So, yeah.
It's got the concision of that movement. All right, let's move on to homolateral strike playing. With homolateral strike, there are 2 different rules that I've given the musicians, by which, if they follow these rules, I think the homolateral state is going to proceed from them. And the first one is strict alternation. Okay? Anything you play on one side of the body, you got to play on the other side of the body. Okay? It is the case in the animal kingdom that any animal who has access to homologous movement, to homolateral movement, also will have the capacity to stop and perhaps push ahead with both legs or reach out with both. The lower patterns are always underlying the more sophisticated patterns. So the musicians are allowed, when they go to the homolateral pattern, you may see some homologous strikes embedded in that. and it will still express the homolateral state. But there are two kinds of things they're going to demonstrate. The first one is, no, I think I'm going to describe them, then you're going to continuously play them. I think that's what we decided. So the first is strict alternation, and then another coordination that preserves the patterning is if one hand is pulsing, is striking, and the other accents the pulses, you still have discrete rhythmic patterns on either side of the body. Now, there are things that they can do that kind of kick them into higher patterning. If they play in a way that ends on an offbeat, then you'll start to. We'll demonstrate that later. Damien is really fascinated with this rule. He may be able to show us that. But they're going to show the two varieties of homolateral strike pattern: alternation and pulsing with accents. I think Damien started. Damien started this.
The trope thing?
Alternating one.
Right.
You want to do the pulse on different sides one? You hear our dialogue, right? Can you hear us? Can you hear him say, "Can I do that?" This has been for them, and goodness knows for me too, like learning a foreign language. And for me, it was like learning a foreign language that no one in the world spoke. So it's been very hard to kind of find my way to these. And when we've worked these things out, we're continuously referring to what is the state of doing this movement. What is it like to live in these patterns? And we have technical rules for what he can do or not, but the rules are those that preserve this state. May we hear the homolateral examples?
Yes, I'll
Great.
do my best. And I think this is a more subtle demonstration because it involves adjacent strings, but this is a composition again by J.S. Bach, and it's from sonata, it's a movement in C major from his A minor sonata. And you'll hear two different activities, and you'll actually see my bow. If you look at the tip of the bow, you'll see more clearly what's happening. That qualifies, right?
Works for me, yeah.
Good. It works for you. Well, you're the expert.
Sonata with the longer melody on top of it.
You know, the tempo of these things, there are many features of the music that can distract you from the pattern activity. No one is used to listening like this. I found, and when we talk about it and when we investigate it, that's really part of it. You know, we're used to listening to the pitches. You know, what I'm asking Stephanie to do and what I've asked them to do is just focus on the movement life of doing this. And so it has taken them a while to see inside the system. But when you kind of sector off your experience to that part of it, it's very consistent. There's that homolateral state, and it's quite similar to this homolateral state. Stephanie also brought forward another example of homolateral patterning that I thought was really interesting. And
this was, of course, completely by accident. I was
Yeah.
just playing things for Andy the other day, and I would say, well, what about this? And what about that? And he'd say something, and I'd say, well, all right, let me try this piece. What do you think of this? And he, oh, well, that's this. So, yeah.
you
so anyway,
should do
yes.
Susan standing.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll do the next Bach example. And this is interesting because it sort of comes out of the first idea, which was the homologous strike idea of something that is really vertical. There's a structure that comes from above and just sort of gets placed down. And I was making the analogy with Bach in that in his sonatas and partitas for violin solo, it's a very unusual piece for violinists to play because normally we're just playing melodic lines. Occasionally we'll play double stops, but it's rare that we have the entire structure to ourselves. And so if you think of listening to a symphony orchestra versus listening to a solo violin, I mean, that's really the difference in compositional style a lot of the time. But with Bach's solo partitas and sonatas, which were written around 1720, he does an amazing thing because he takes 4 strings and 4 fingers and 1 bow and 1 brain and makes a complete work out of it, which means that we have a greater sense of structure. Incidentally, there's very little written for violin solo because it's a difficult instrument to write solo music for and have a sense of being complete. But I brought out the idea of a physical structure, and we sort of made another analogy to this. It's sort of like laying down the foundations of a building, and that you will make a sense of, well, here's where one corner is going to be, here's another corner, here's another, here's another. Beethoven does this beautifully in the opening of the 7th Symphony, which is one of my favorite examples.
What I found so interesting is that Bach lays out these kind of columns or pillars of the composition with homologous strokes, foundational movements. And then he fills in each one of them, starts to develop the harmonic material using the next highest up level of patterning, using the homolateral patterning. And oftentimes, depending on where the discussion goes eventually, I have found many, many examples of how composers manipulate these possibilities to achieve the structures that they're...
It's very much like building a texture over
Right.
music history.
Right.
So I'll just
Yeah,
give
do
an
it.
example of this is from the Adagio in G minor for sonata, and I'll do it just in terms of the structure, the homologous structure, and then I'll fill in the gaps. Thank you, Bach.
And it's on its way to other movements. Contralateral strike. All right, the rule for contralateral strike is that within the action of making music, you in order to complete a musical thought, in order to fulfill a musical thought, you've got an accentuation in one side of the body that is fulfilled by accentuation on the other side of the body, so that the movement impulse crosses the midline, and the hands are able to speak to each other conversationally in the contralateral patterning. Contralateral patterning, strike patterning, can be deceptive because it looks like just playing music, because it's everything a human can do. But we found a few examples that accentuate the contralateral conversation. And I think you were going to start in this one, and yeah.
Just whatever.
Just whatever. Yeah, keep going. He'll join you.
Just let me say something first.
Yeah. Just felt like you needed to come back to that.
Yeah, one of the there are many structural principles and terms for what composers do structurally with these patterns and one of them is downshifting through the patterns. You can get very characteristic effects when you shift up through the patterns and down through the patterns, and you can see in many compositions composers upshifting and downshifting through these patterns to achieve, stopping motions and accelerating motions and expanding motions and coalescing motions and things like that. Steph?
They all have a distinctive pull. Different.
They're like harmony because that's right.
They pull you in different directions.
Yeah, those are other structural properties. I've also thought about them as like attractor patterns and, patterns that pull activity towards them and patterns that get exhausted after a while and run out. And there's one really interesting example. If I ask Bill to stay in alternating homolateral strike, he'll do it for a while, but then his body will start to shiver and fall apart. And it's very hard to simply stay in some patterns. They want to precipitate out into other places. Mm-hmm. Shall we hear the contralateral ones?
I'll do my best. These are particularly difficult
challenging
examples because they require some sort of virtuosic technique. But I pulled out a couple of examples and asked, perhaps this is it, and he said yes. So I'll try to do these for you.
It's the conversationality between her hands, the impulse between the hands.
And I'll probably do this a little under tempo.
Isn't that cool?
That's from a piece by Pablo de Sarasate called Zapateado, which normally is. That's up to tempo. Okay, I had to do it once slowly, warm up on it. Another example I found from Alexander Glazonov's violin concerto, which apparently qualifies. So the combination of what the left hand is doing, string crossing, and then bowing patterns.
Generally, anything that's syncopated. The syncopation in there requires a contralateral exchange between the hands.
And then another example, brief example, which we came up with, this is from Vieuxtemps. Henri Vieuxtemps has some wonderful violin concerti that are never heard, unfortunately, and one of the most wonderful is the fifth.
Well, it starts out homolateral, just so you can follow it, and then the bowing creates this contralaterality at a certain point.
So I'm playing it. That's
the whole thing?
That's the Vieuxtemps. Yeah. Well,
I'm
continue.
sorry.
Okay.
That's not going.
That's a little bit more. And then we found another example from Bach, which you said qualified. So.
Yeah.
Would you like me to play that?
I want you to play it. What's interesting about this is how I think it's homologous. It begins homologously, right?
Yeah, then it sort of goes
then at a certain point, you can hear there's been enough homologous action, and Bach shifts into contralaterality. Fascinating. I've seen this in so many of Beethoven's structures. He'll lay out he'll state a theme homologously, and then his development of it is immediately a movement into the contralateral. So I was interested to see it in Bach as well. Maybe I'll show the Beethoven later, depending on where things go. But let's hear it in the Bach.
This is from, again, the G minor sonata. This is the Sicilian. I'll just do a little bit.
Yeah. Beautiful. I'm wondering actually whether you all can follow the contralaterality of it, because I can tell as I'm watching, I know what I'm drawing on to define it, and I'm watching her like point of attention go from the bow to the fingers. There's you know, she's in the middle of a bowing, and then her mind, I can see, shifts to her fingers, which stabilizes, and she changes the bow. I'm actually watching her mind, I think, go back and
that's a
forth
scary place.
between the fingers, and aren't all of ours. Maybe, could you play it one more time,
Sure,
just
sure.
so they can have a chance to watch? And I'll scream there when that's
All right. Yeah, and again, this is melody and accompaniment at the same time, so that's what makes it very complex.
there. Here we go. I couldn't bring myself to shout over your playing, frankly. Could you see it? Could you see the... It's very... I mean, I could have you play it again and again, but I'm not going to do it.
Well, it's getting better, you know. Now that I'm warming up.
The sensation of the experience is when you homologous. Obviously, homologous feels very centered and stable, and homolateral also feels centered and stable, but usually just leaning towards one side and staying there.
Mm-hmm.
And when the contralateral happens, it's this feeling of tension and instability that goes between. I mean, I think it's exceptionally clear playing drums because you can see it's this when you're homologous, and when you're homolateral, it still feels very steady. It's very grounded, but there's one side that's more dominant. And then as soon as you start accenting that syncopation, it needs to lean, it needs to resolve someplace, and so you can feel that torque in your body. And usually relax into some sort of homologous state kind of a thing. And so it's a little easier to see on a percussive kind of element where you have a little bit more of that right-left physicality kind of a thing.
Should we do one that shifts gears, the two of us? Because that's really the clearest way, I think.
Go from one to the other?
One from homologous to homolateral to contralateral.
You know what I would like to do, though, because I want to clear it out for questions as quickly as possible. I want to take them through a few other thoughts and then release it. And I think that it would probably make sense to come back to playing sometime during the time afterwards. We've prepared a lot of things. There are many more examples. And also, I mean, one of the things that I've done with this whole body of work is to develop a notational approach to it. And, you know, we can revisit that as well. And so maybe in the notational approach we could you know, do something like that. Before I open it to questions, I just want to say a few other things of where my investigation has gone, because we're just like at the front door, having opened the door and not even really inside yet. The first problem that I set myself, which was to account for the movement of the musicians, the patterns in several dimensions, well, that opened up strike patterns and gave me a way to experience the patterns through rhythms. However, I had a very strong feeling that if pattern life were really an important element of musicality, that it must be expressed in ways besides just the rhythmic part of the compositions. I had a strong conviction that pitch choices and pitch movement must also express pattern life. This has been a really challenging area to develop ideas in. But there are another set of patterns that we call sweep patterns. And sweep patterns acknowledge the horizontal dimension of you're running along there on the ground and you go to the right or you go to the left. And we've developed as well rules for homologous sweep patterns, homologous movement in this range, homolateral movement in this range, and contralateral movement in the horizontal. But I'm not going to have you all play the examples, only because I want to move things along. So there is a fairly large vocabulary right now that we've been speaking of homologous, contralateral, and homolateral strike patterns, and the same 3 sweep patterns. You may have noticed that I've ignored the spinal patterns. And it's not because I think that they're irrelevant. It's because they're really not expressed through the hands. I think they are involved in music making. You know, you see a conductor or musicians mark the beat with the head. I think that they're present and they belong in this account, but maybe not in this part of the account. So there's this vocabulary that I've developed. And I want to tell you very briefly the 5 principal areas, 5 principal kinds of investigations I've been making with this vocabulary. One of them is notational. And, you know, I've developed a set of notational conventions that lets you use the vocabulary in building improvisations or potentially building compositions. So that's one large area that you could ask me about. If you guys want to talk about it, great. And we have actually we've prepared to play a few examples of notations so they're, you know, they can show us what it is. Another area that has gotten a lot of my attention is investigations based on finding what is the grammar or syntax at work in this system. How do these patterns speak? How do they combine? You know, by what principles do they combine? What are the natural relationships among them? How do they naturally behave one to the other? Instinctively I want to use them to analyze pieces of music, and I've done that. I've analyzed pieces, and what I find I'm developing is a description of the music life embedded in a score. That's why I've called this whole work Locomotion Encoded Musical Patterns. I look at the score, and now I'm able to read the movement life, and I've been producing what I've been calling kinemorphic descriptions of the movement life intrinsic to a piece of music. So that's another area that's been very interesting to me. And it also lets you look at certain composers' works and identify tropes in their works or tropes in a period. And it can be a useful tool, I think, for analysis. More capable analysts than I am, I wish that they would use this tool. I'm very interested in the worth of this in modeling music cognition and helping us understand how music is heard and how music is felt and how music is perceived, what happens in our minds when we're thinking about music. There's a complementarity between these ideas and a lot of other thought, basically thought about embodied cognition in a lot of fields. Another interesting question, cognitive question, is can you hear LEMPs? LEMPs. Locomotion Encoded Musical Patterns. And my acronym is LEMPs. So when you're listening to a piece of music, it's fine if I tell you these are the patterns, but are we actually hearing them, and to what extent are we hearing them? That's a very interesting investigation, and I've done some work in that area too. I would love to get someone interested in checking out the brains performing these patterns in MRI machines. I know that there's a researcher, Zatori, in Montreal, who I know has built an MRI machine with a piano, with a keyboard outside of it. So, I'd love to have the chance to have these patterns evaluated by neuroscientists and say what can we substantiate or not. I know that there have been some collaborations planned between people who teach these patterns and neuroscientists. I don't think they came to fruition. I don't think that the studies were done. And then also, I've done a lot of thinking about what is this as a metaphor? Clearly this word, these homologous strike, these terms that I've made, clearly they're representing something. They're metaphors, but what kind of metaphors and how do they behave? And so I've thought a lot about the nature of these things as metaphors. Then the final large body of investigations I made are in something called evolutionary musicology. And it's interesting to see what use these patterns will have for helping you understand things like the origins of musical behavior, for the behavior of musical entities as things that evolve and things that change. Evolutionary musicology would look at all of those questions and more. So I think that the most promising areas are to look at the contribution that these patterns would have made to the development of metrical cognition. The development of oneness, two-ness, three-ness in our movement life, in our rhythmic life. I have actually a wonderful little video clip of animals that maybe I'll pull out later. That support that. There's also, I think, strong evidence in these patterns that there are processing predispositions in the human mind. You know, we're born ready to hear these things in music because we're born ready to hear movement life in the world around us. So there are you know, musicologists and neuroscientists who look at what our processing dispositions are. I think some of them have to do with these matters as well. There are great theories about how music came to be as an element in social bonding. That, you know, the development of music is very much a social development, and I think the movement patterning life certainly speaks to that as well. Our movement life determines qualities of our social life, and sometimes very ecstatic qualities of our social life. You think of how animals kind of exult in these patterns together in herding and flocking and galloping. You know, a particular pattern can be run as a transcendental state in a lot of situations, and I think we still go for that. So, and then the last idea is. You know about genetics, where a gene is expressed through generations. There's a very interesting field of memetics, which is the notion of an artifact that's transmitted culturally, not biologically. So, you know, you look at the development of a particular hairstyle over several decades, and you have a memetic event at work. I think there are music analysts helping to define you know, musical memetics, and I think that this is potentially a tool. There are things that you can describe about the relationship of a piece of music in one era at one moment and another era based on what's happening to the movement development in it. So those are the areas. There are other concerns that these guys have brought to me that I haven't paid much attention to. They've been very interested in the ergonomics of it, in like the health of playing, and Damien particularly.
We should take some questions actually from the audience at this point.
I'm pretty much done. There are a few other areas.
We'll come back, but you know, I think maybe they've like, been working on questions for a while that they're dying to ask. So, are there any questions at this time? Yes.
How does the human voice factor into all of this? Because I would just assume that the human voice was probably the earliest of all human instruments in the course of evolution. I know a lot of ethnomusicologists focus solely on the music of the human voice. So does that have any relevance?
Yeah. It's I've tried to make sense of this too, and I've only been able to approach it by bringing a few other ideas into the picture. I thought, okay, if these things are true with two hands, they're probably true with, well, it's probably expressed in one limb as well. So I've had to develop a vocabulary for finding the patterns in a single limb. You know, a lot of music, you're only looking at one limb going on. So some of the tools that I have used to define pattern activity in a single limb may be promising for looking at the voice. There's a notion of motor equivalence, that the body accepts the realization of a movement, you know, in a kind of translated form in another part of the body. And the concept of motor equivalence, I think, would be relevant for the voice if you look at mechanisms, vocal mechanisms, that either have a kind of tuneness to it. You know, there's a back and forth. You know, there's the arytenoid and hyoid process in the vocal box that, you know, you squeeze from one end and squeeze from another. And if you look at vocal cultures that yodel, that like, ee-hoo, ee-hoo, ee-hoo. I can't yodel, but I can go back and forth. And I can develop kind of a tuneness. So can I tease some theory out there? Probably eventually.
Does it have to do with like the architecture of the vocal pattern?
Of the vocal. Well, I look first at the lived movement experience. I'm always going from that to the ideas about sound. But I also think another place to look for clues about what the voice might have to do with this is if you looked at movements of singers. And I think that you would be very likely to find singers' bodies stabilizing, you know, homolaterally or releasing contralaterally to facilitate different kinds of vocality.
If I might add, actually, your question, because you talked about sort of the earliest instrument. An early use for the drum would have been in signaling and communication across a great distance, because the voice could not carry that well, and the drum could make a sound that would be very percussive and would transmit for a much greater distance. And so I think that's another consideration.
Absolutely,
for
which means that
communication
then you'd think about the voice as a partner to the drum. So you'd be thinking almost of the voice as another limb.
Well, it's an extension of the voice. I mean, if you want to tell the people across the way that we're coming over for dinner, or we're going to come make war on you, you could send a drum signal over and communicate that idea.
Get the spine involved too, because if I think when I play one drum, I still have that experience, and I also have a front back experience, even playing one drum, and so it's probably something of that sort of
The
adjusting.
vocal, that should be in the mix
that,
too.
The curving and the up and
Spinal patterns should be in the mix with the vocal analysis.
We have another
first?
question.
As it follows up on what
Yeah.
Alan was saying, it seems it would also have something to do with breath, because just an airstream, I think when you play a wind instrument or whatnot, has different dimensionality depending on what kind of music you're playing. So you got to be breathing when you're doing what you're doing. So it seems to me that the breath has to have some. It's part of the dimensionality of what you're doing. Yes?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm sitting here thinking I don't know enough about breath, but I'm thinking it, acknowledging that I would need to know more in order to move into an analysis of it. I have no doubt that there are characteristics of breath that correspond to pattern life. I can't prove it, but I bet there are. Yes?
Can you talk about it in terms of visual art? Mm-hmm. I'd be really curious to hear what you have to say about it.
Yeah, I want to hear what other people have to say about it, too. Here's what I've thought. I've thought very literally about it, I'm afraid. I've thought about it in terms of representation of the human body, and that when you see a representation of a person involved in one of the movement forms, one of these things had that archer, and that's a homolateral stabilization. So I think we participate in pattern life when we see images that suggest the pattern. I don't consider that a very sophisticated look into this. I think other people should do better than I am.
Mimicking,
Yeah.
but I'm just
It was the famous
abstractly
Pollock
speaking.
movie.
Yeah. Colors.
Well, one thing I would say is that
And rhythms and
perception is so strongly cross-modal. And I wouldn't be surprised if people who are synesthetes, who experience in one medium and then translate it into another medium, wouldn't have very strong movement correspondences for certain colors. Whether they're universal or not, I have no idea.
Andy, there was a famous movie that was made of Jackson Pollock painting in the early 50s.
Okay, this would be a connection,
Right,
yeah.
He showed the dancing.
Motion,
with the
yes.
brush.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
Okay, so brush strokes are going to certainly reflect movement, and strokes in any medium are going to reflect movement.
I would say to that, because I'm one of the, obviously it's why I drifted to being a musician, but I process every single thing I see orally. Like I see that chair pattern and immediately I hear something to play. That's just how my brain works. And so I've always particularly been drawn to certain artists, and I've sort of on my own explored, and almost 100% of the time as I dig into their life, they were musicians or they were huge music aficionados. And it's just the way that, like Paul Klee is a great example of that, and Pollock is another one of my favorites, and Picasso, and they're people that were majorly inspired by music or were musicians like Paul Klee was and stuff. And I think it has to do with that you see something and you make that sound, and it's why I was drawn towards playing for dance as well. And I think just as a drummer in general, it's like everything. If I see that lady scarf, or I see a human figure, or just a person's face, to me it's sound. And so I think that there's a relation to that. And since I've been working with Andy on this stuff, I've started to try to articulate to myself and analyze to myself what I'm doing, like when I'm playing dance class. And I realize there's a lot of one-to-one, but there's also a lot of sort of energy back and forth of of realizing the spirals and the leanings and that kind of thing in what I'm doing. And it's interesting because just yesterday in both classes, actually, because there was another one in one of the classes that I teach. It's like a rhythmics like class to dancers, and I was demonstrating. I was giving them their first polyrhythm 2 against 3, and I was playing it. One of the dancers said, "Wow, I just see this spiral happening in your body," and I thought, "Oh, I wish I could tell you about this other thing I'm working on, but I don't have time." And then later on that evening, in a music for dance class, which is kind of a history and analysis of Western music for dancers, I was showing them. We were talking about rondo form, and I showed them the piano. Mozart's Rondo for Piano and Orchestra. And when I finished it, the first question that was asked is, the girl said, "What is it called in music when like the piano is playing one hand there and he moves up and down with this hand?" And I was like, "That's the second in class."
Homolateral sweep.
Right, homolateral sweep, which is what my answer was. But it's just interesting. Like it's just how people process the things and how it's immediately crossed. Even when you're not, like for me, I'm aware of it and I'm thinking about it a lot right now. But even if you're not, like these people whose their aesthetic is their body and everything, that's how they were processing the sound that I was making. So it's just like the converse of what I'm doing is I'm processing their movement into sound. And so visual arts, I think, is the same thing. I think it's how you perceive and how you internalize and digest.
It's in the modern.
Mondrian is another one of my favorite artists as well.
I just have to say, one thing Damien said to me before we came out, he was telling me about playing class and using these patterns in class, and he said, "I really think it's a question of empathy." He said, "I think it's about empathy." And I think that that's the answer to the visual arts as well. The phenomenon of empathy may define the relationship between the movement patterns and your visual experience.
But if I might add something also, because you brought up the analogy between color and sound and music, and both actually have these physical properties that are very abstract to us for the most part, but they do exist. The proportions of music, for instance, the interval of the octave, which is in the ratio of 1 to 2, and I could show it to you quickly in my violin. If I have a string length and the sound is G, when it's vibrating at the full length, if I stop it exactly halfway, that divides the string into 2 parts, and it sounds a note an octave higher. So the frequency has doubled. The string length is now half of what it was. And these, what are called natural harmonics, where I put my finger down very lightly, are notes which are exact places where the string measures, divides into very precise measurements. So the octave being 1 to 2, the fifth being 2 to 3. So that's 2 parts out of 3. This would be 3 parts out of 4, which is the fourth. And similarly, there are frequencies associated with different colors that vibrate. And so in a sense, you also have intervals between colors which are used in balance in paintings and to create a composition in a painting. So there are very, very strong correlations, but we're just not.
Very promising.
Usually
She's making me.
Well, this is the whole music of the sphere stuff.
Right.
Well, let's my brain's a scary
I think
place.
where that might become useful with this is you could start looking at proportionality. The way that a pattern is fulfilled.
Yeah.
Is a pattern fulfilled on its largest scale, a half scale, 3/4 scale? All of those have resonances. The proportions themselves have resonances.
Color heads.
The gentleman here
Has been waiting.
Yes.
right here.
Oh. And also that gentleman there.
So I find it really fascinating what you're all doing, this sort of search on, I would maybe call it sort of a basic alphabet,
Yeah.
some kind of way that's going to be combined to make these higher musical forms.
Yes.
But to go from the homologous, it's basically it's based on two-ness, right? You're sort of simultaneously having the twos, and then the homolateral is either alternating or they're a different. This is four that I'm hitting.
The essence is differentiation.
Yeah, which is kind of a homologous, occasionally homologous.
Absolutely.
Right. This one goes.
Absolutely.
So those I think are pretty clearly defined. Can you describe again the contralateral? Because with the animal locomotion, it's defined as way four limbs are moving, right, in pairs. They're moving differently. And so you have to go to a sort of different structural definition when you're dealing with only two hands to get to the contralateral. I mean, it's clearly more complex. And I could hear the going back and forth with the melodies. But could you?
There are a couple different ideas that need to come into the picture. The first is that by what right am I calling an event in only the forelegs? How am I giving a name to something that happens only in the front limbs to an event which is actually defined by all four limbs? I mean, that's a paradox that I struggled with at the beginning. And I think finally, I don't know that I have a great answer to it, but I think this concept of motor equivalence is the best I can do, that our brains do seem to have the same experience. A lot of this is phenomenologically defined. I mean, it's really, the musicians have been trying these states, and I've been trying these states, and a lot of people have tried these states and kind of testified to their consistency. So, the fact that it's a four-limb event that we're talking about here, I'm not dealing decisively with that. I may be taking some liberties defining these two-limb states. But they are very distinct one from the other in their four-limb occurrences. And I only showed the Frankenstein, part of it. If I actually leave the Frankenstein state and move across my body, then it's much clearer. If I'm restricted to this, I still have a lot of movement, I think. But as soon as I can, cross my body, I don't really even have to think. That's homolateral, 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 contralateral, contralateral, this and this, right? Homologous, homologous, homolateral, homolateral, homolateral. I'm in homolateral today. So, now that's really interesting. Probably I'm in homolateral because I'm in front of an audience and I'm restricting where I am. I'm probably in front of a stage. So let's shift. If I remember the contralateral state, I have to refer to this feeling of the diagonal in my body. There we go. See, it lets me do something else emotionally, psychologically. I reached with this and this at the same time to turn me. That's the contralateral experience. Is this speaking to your question?
Well, okay, so I agree that they're defined with the forelimb, and I also agree that if those are basic patterns in our brain and mind, that we then could change them into other modalities that have the same basic patterning.
Yeah.
So then what I'm not seeing, though, is that when you're going to two, where is that translation of the four-limbed contralateral pattern? What is the analogy in your contralateral definition?
The way that I've made a distinction is on
where are these four limbs? Where are these four metaphorically, or literally?
Where do the four limbs go? When you create a syncopation, there's like a suspension. There's a space that is opened up by a missing note, and then something that responds to it across. Are you with me that far? I think that, to me, that feels like I actually should move again to figure this out. But, when you move contralaterally, you have a similar event. You've got a reach. The contralateral in animals is initiated with a limb reaching into space rather than with the legs. So you have this reach, and then you have this point of suspension, and then you have the catching of it with the opposite leg. You go that dum, dum. It falls very naturally into triplets. So I think that kind of abstract space and sound space of an event, a suspension, and then a landing is really my justification of what happens between the hands. There's a strike that's answered by something in the other hand, but you can't have an answer unless there was a journey across. I'm answering analogously, but citing an experience that is so clear once you participate in it. Actually, let me show you one video of these animals. It's just too good not to. And I have it ready. We won't have to run around for it. Let's see. Here we go. All right, this is a video that is designed to suggest that our experience of oneness, two-ness, and three-ness is actually also a vertebrate legacy.
And one, and one, and one, and
homologous movement.
one, and two, and
homolateral,
one, and two,
same
and
side
one,
initiation.
Two, and one, and two, and one, and two.
Now here goes the contralateral.
One and two. 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3.
Okay, you can feel something about it with that. Stephanie and I looked really closely at this video because we kind of figured, wait a minute, you kind of fudged something there in the third one. The counting wasn't quite right the way I've recorded it. And when we looked closely at it, we realized that it was closer to what I just described to you. That the 1 really is the reach, the 2 is empty space, and the 3 is the catching of the limb. That's the best answer I can give. I don't think I'm gonna. Yeah.
And in application, in terms of putting it, as we explored it, especially for myself, especially around a kit where I had a little more, where I was using 4 limbs and I could restrict it to just using 2 limbs and feel the experience together. Because if I pull 4 in, I can immediately feel all that kind of thing. But just using 2 hands, you can really feel the difference between going, this, obviously, and going 1, 2, 1, 2, where it's a real evenness. And as soon as you put that in 3, you have to go bump, but, duh. It needs to go back to the other side. And even if I do a double sticking, it takes you back and forth very, very much. And it's the same kind of thing with the syncopation, is if I'm playing this, homolateral, this is very strong, it's right, left, right, left, right, left. But as soon as I syncopate the offbeat, it needs to go, it needs to land back. So what we've sort of, as a rule, we've sort of said, okay, so this is homolateral, and as soon as you pull, you create that lift that needs to go to the other side, and so it turns that immediately into contralateral. So you're here, and you're here, and as soon as you go, you feel that need to resolve physically. You know what I mean? So that's sort of how we've taken that. It's a good question. It was my first thing too. I was like, I'm not feeling. And as soon as I went through the journey myself, and I felt like that sensation, there was no doubt about it to me. That thing.
You seem to be dealing with sequential or movement patterns. What about stop patterns, harmonic patterns, where we want something else to happen besides the movement, whether it's any one or all of these 3 movements, something to stop and to pull it all together and to harmonize it. In evolutionary terms, a harmonic pattern made much later than the original, organic chant or whatever that is. I'm not sure about.
Are you talking about a movement occurrence that would have the kind of impact and qualities of harmony in music? Or am I misunderstanding you?
It's also a fit, but I'm talking about something in contrast to sequences or movements. The things that stop, that join each other.
I think it's
we seek that as much as we seek any one or all of these 3 patterns. We seek we keep looking for it, even when Stephanie was playing. We're seeking sometimes where the notes come together and then they come apart. Outside of it's a different modality, but it's very fundamental, is what I'm suggesting.
So is it relevant that so many composers end pieces with homologous unities? I mean, it's such an unarguable ending.
There's a lot of they're going back and forth from what I call stop patterns, harmonic patterns, where there's combinations that touch us deeply, and alternating with sequential patterns of the kind.
I see what you're saying.
And there are some, even in movement, for example, in Feldenkrais movement, which you may be familiar with, there's an attempt to create a contralateral or a homolateral kind of activity in which no sooner than one does this, one also does this. One is used to this, but one has to be used to this. The combination creates a certain discordance, and yet the discordance is enlightening in some way. I think Dalcroze tried to do the same thing with music, in which discordant pattern, differential movements of different parts of the body occurring at the same time are in some way enlightening, so that if it's almost like if you had 2 or 3 of your movement patterns all occurring at the same time.
Well, I'm not at all suggesting that anybody wants these patterns to be pure or, in reality and in music, they're in all kinds of relationships to each other. But also remember, this is a metaphor based on locomotion. It's not going to cover a lot of things. There's a lot in music that this doesn't address.
But if I understand that...
Locomotion is a desire to stop and harmonize also. The two are in
Right. Stillness is part of locomotion too.
Well, maybe this also relates a little bit to the idea of dissonance and consonance in music, which for me, consonance has no meaning unless you have dissonance. And cadences, we hear cadences coming up, in terms of the structure. We hear a 5/7 chord leading back to the tonic, but usually before that, many things have happened. Bach sets up incredible dissonances in his music, which are often quite disguised because he's so skillful, but you'll see intervals that would be, if you took them by themselves, they would be considered to be a contemporary composer's interval, such as an augmented fourth or diminished octave or something, where there's inherently great conflict. And so then when he resolves that, there's a sense of relief that we have been looking for this. And then often, as well, there's a rhythmic sense of relief. When you talk about the ultimate sound that we hear in a composition, there's a finality to it, which often has been built up to with a sense of momentum or excitement. And so we're dealing also with a sense of momentum.
The language is very potent for creating tension and relaxation with movement gestures. I mean, it's right there for that. And those are always going to be in dialogue with tension relaxation schemes in other dimensions of the music.
Somebody else had a question? Yes?
I mean, first of all, this is so exciting for me because about 30 years ago, I wanted to do my dissertation on the origins of music. And there's a convergence now that there's the Steve Mikan book on the singing music intervals. And now your work that, and then that Bonnie's work would come into it too. And I love her work. And I think what would be interesting would be to look at, I think an easy study would be people listening to homologous or homolateral and music and filling out mood questionnaires, it's like associations, because
the challenge would be there's not a lot of music that's purely one pattern or another. I mean, there probably is some. Homolateral till you're done with it, right? Homolateral sweet patterns. But you could actually, Stephanie is right. You could probably find music in which a certain pattern predominates. That's true. That would be a nice thing to look at.
The other association I had was that in 2005 I was working with tsunami survivors and doing some EMDR trauma work with them, which is this sort of bilateral movement, this idea that you would get through a trauma or something. And then I went to a conference where Mickey Hart did a drum circle. And I realized that there's so much movement. And that drumming is this easy, natural way that's bilateral stimulation. And walking and all sorts of things that help us keep going through emotional experiences.
Great. I'm really glad I came tonight because it comes on the heels of my finishing the Oliver Sacks's
Music is Good, which
I
haven't read, so.
I think he's just in the Bronx.
Maybe he'll read it to me.
Please, you seem like you'd be a natural fit. Really.
I do want to read it.
What he says, as far as the origins of music, is that we're actually born with a certain musical sense in that our brains have a kind of inborn rhythm. Your ability, I don't remember the exact figures, but to say, take visual snapshots every 40 seconds, whatever it is, and finds analogies that process in our aural senses as well. And then the book goes through a lot of different variations on the relation of mind to music, but he looks for in some of his clients disruptions in this rhythmical processing of cognitive data, and so on. He's trying to use it as a diagnostic tool. And, this is just a comment, it's not a question.
I find this really beautiful, the notion that we have all these biological periodicities in us that, combine to make the symphony of us being. And, we have our breathing, we have our heart rate, but, we even have, probably how long it takes to move our digits, has a characteristic length of time to it. And walking is a periodicity, crying and laughing has a periodicity, and there are probably so many ways in which rhythms are installed in our makeup that we don't even know about yet.
Just one comment. That's what Leonard Bernstein spoke about in the Norton Lectures, the unanswered question. When he was talking periodicity, was really vocalizations and music.
So periodicity, vocalizations are governed by periodicities. Early vocalizations are.
Well, for example, the word ma, which is common to many cultures. He took that through, and it showed the musicality of that.
Of that word.
Yeah.
I've looked at little parts of those lectures, but I would look for that part of it.
I think that was the first lecture.
Okay.
We also had a question that arrived online.
Where'd it go?
I gave it to you. That's all I could say.
I left it in the back room, I think.
Oh, you did?
Oh,
but I thought of it as soon as they started talking about this.
Okay. Well, I have a question for you.
I remember that one, but
I don't mean to interrupt other people's questions, but I was thinking of Le Sacre du Printemps and Nijinsky's choreography and Stravinsky's music and the correlations, because his choreography was so rare at the time. I mean, have you ever thought about, coming from your dance background, is that a piece that you've looked at ever, or in terms of choreography?
I've seen the reconstructions of the Nijinsky Sacre, but I actually want to answer it with another Stravinsky piece, and not with that Nijinsky, but with his sister, because I just looked at the Les Noces, which is, I think the choreography is by his sister, isn't it? Anthony, isn't there a choreography with Bronislaw Nijinsky? And I found it remarkable. I mean, you have this angular music, which is so clear in its rhythmic profile, and you just in a lot of Stravinsky, both in the Sacre and in Les Noces, I'm sure that if I analyzed it, you're going to see very, very clear. In fact, one of my musical examples is from Les Noces, one of the ones that I've been playing. The pattern life in that music is really clear. And I don't think it's any accident that the way it's choreographed is with almost freezes of movement. Yes. Moving freezes in which you can see the homolaterality. You can see it change with the contralaterality, and then it'll move with an opposition in the body. It's almost as though those pieces and that era represents a study of these patterns. It's, I'm sure they weren't consciously doing it, but they. Oh, great.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Okay, all right.
Yeah, there's an uncanny resemblance. They seem to be preoccupied with the same way of relating to these patterns.
Oh, here's a question that has just come through. Can you clarify what is going on? I believe I missed it. Is what is happening, the music that is an effect from their movements in regards to their spines, etc. Maybe we should just rewind the whole thing.
Yeah.
That's not the question we had originally.
In essence, yes. the music is expressive. That's the original.
Okay, thank you. Maybe
the music is expressive
question,
of the pattern
we were
life.
Looking for. Yes. Do you see some connections between your rhythmic body movements in harmony with the rhythm of spoken sung words, and liturgy, public worship? Do typical puritanical values keep many Americans from the interactivity seen elsewhere, as intuitively or culturally expressed, for example, in worship it says workship, but I think he means worship, involving Latin and African immigrants.
Can you say who was the person who...
And the person who sent this is Donald Weigel, W-I-G-A-L. Ask this question.
It's
Yes,
two
a very complicated question.
very different questions.
Who wants to tackle this question?
Well, you know, Damien actually was raised studying eurythmics, weren't you?
Well, not very. I mean, we studied it. I went to music conservatories, Cleveland Institute of Music and Juilliard, and we had to take rhythmics. I took 8 semesters of rhythmics. But actually, that question immediately made me think of davening, which is a Jewish Jewish temple. Is that as you're reading the prayers, you get into sort of, which it's any meditative state really, but you get into a sort of your own rhythm and flow that's happening that maybe doesn't necessarily, you're not going don't eat and to eat, but you're feeling the cycle, which I mean I don't know, and maybe it may just be my hyperactivity, but whenever I'm sitting anywhere, I start to feel some sort of flow, and it's whatever you're tapping into some sort of greater rhythmic bio rhythms or something like that. But if you like stop, and we talked about this in rhythmics actually in college, where everyone tried to find what their natural tempo was, and everyone had and even if you were psyched up that day or depressed, that you were still within a close range, and people had really unique like inner tempos that they just were always there. If you just sat for a second and just thought about it, at one point where you start to move and how you start to just sort of, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with like the tempo of your breath or the tempo of your heartbeat at all. It's a whole nother, maybe it's the unity and interaction of all of your body chemistry happening at once. But definitely, in terms of that question, I feel like there's sort of that, and I think it doesn't have to necessarily just with religious worship, but
there's also Sufi spinning, which is I think there's a kind of position in the body that you spin through that supports your spin. I don't know anything about it, but there's probably a posture that supports the spin, and it stays consistent. So one thing I'm speculating is the liturgical use of pattern life, kind of the focused, contemplative staying in one state long enough to feel many things about that state, rather than running a lot of states together. I don't know.
Well, it does require a focus, an inner calmness to be able to...
Well, what is the...
Occupy any.
Yeah.
The I think it's Korean, the dance that's like incredibly slow movement. You know that thing? And it's like the whole day. Buto. Like the whole, like a half an hour dance of it's just like a person. It's like standing up, basically.
Buto
it's like the whole dance. But but you could not possibly do that transition unless there was some sort of, unless you were living in some sort of pulse that was happening, that you were living through.
It's not arbitrary.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of sort of music and motion occupy space and time, and so it's a matter of how.
And I think applying it to these sort of principles directly, again, I mean, as a drummer and a timekeeper, and feeling those things, I mean, it's like you start to get into a state. I can go back to this thing that I was doing yesterday, but if I'm doing that, and I feel this, and I want to feel against it, you start to feel a greater thing that happens on top of it. And then there's also a big, all these things that are happening around it, and they all sorts of, and then if you're the type of person that processes things visually, maybe you see like a large, all these maybe concentric spheres that are rolling around each other, something like that. But I mean, and it kind of, and it would go to that because it takes you that, because here I'm obviously just one thing, and then this is it's crossing my body, but it's homolateral in terms of sonically, right? It's crossing. And then when you throw that in, and you immediately tip it back and forth, so then you go into that contralateral state. So you're kind of getting into this thing, and then on top of that, kind of applying to that question is once you get into that, you have all these other rhythms that sort of start happening around it. I don't know. At least for me, that's what happens.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
When you execute it, you have a different sensation so you start to experiment, like Andy was talking about.
I just wanted to make a comment. With your motions you were always in motion. You never stopped and started, and this is actually something that is very applicable to playing the violin and I think playing other instruments as well. That you can sort of think of an arc, a pendulum, but not stopping and starting. This is very sort of unmusical. Your body gets out of the rhythm of what you're trying to do, and it affects the sound, it affects the rhythm, and of course it makes you much more tense. And so it was very interesting to see that you were constantly in motion there. We have to, I think we have to call it a night. Well, thank you so much. Many, many thanks to Andy Warshaw, and Damien and Bill. Thank you.
Further information about our programs and the complete archive of past Philip Tatey's events is available at philiptateys.org.